I'm Daniela Ligero. I am the CEO of Together for Girls, and we are really delighted to have all of you with us here today. I want to start by thanking all of our partners that you saw on the screen, as well as the Together for Girls team for putting together this event. And in particular, I want to thank Catherine Brandon and Chrissy Hart for all their work. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started with our really exciting program. I encourage you to take a look at the chat because we actually have the full bios of all our amazing speakers. We will not be going through that one by one in terms of the introduction. So if you want to learn more about our speakers, please click on that link. It should be there. Also, there will be a moment for Q&A. And so if you want to ask questions, we ask that you use the Zoom chat. And instead of just to panelists, you need to click to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your questions. And finally, the event today is in English, but we will be translating with subtitles into French and Spanish in a couple of weeks, and we'll let you know when that's available. So with that, let's get started. I want to start by acknowledging that we live in unprecedented times. With the global pandemic that has been COVID-19, in addition to the staggering loss of life that we've seen all over the world, we have also lost decades of progress on so many important issues like poverty reduction, gender equality, violence prevention, overall well-being, and educational attainment. And as communities around the world continue to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, over 1.5 billion children have been impacted by school closures worldwide. Levels of sexual and gender-based violence against children and women have soared. And in addition, girls face particular barriers to school reentry that need to be urgently addressed. And today we're going to be talking about gender-based violence and education. And one of the things that we've been saying for a while is that when it comes to the issue of gender-based violence, or as the UN Secretary General has recently described it, the shadow pandemic, and education, we as a global community need to be able to hold two truths at once. The first truth is that schools are instrumental to ending gender-based violence by helping to change harmful gender norms, creating safe spaces, decreasing the acceptability of violence, supporting girls' agency and empowerment, reshaping masculinity that is nonviolent and non-toxic, and engaging parents and communities, among others. The second truth we have to hold is that schools are often not safe for girls, for boys, and for gender-expansive youth. Even before the pandemic, children, adolescents, and young people experience unacceptably high levels of violence in and around schools. But really, as many of you have said already, and we continue to hear, there is an opportunity to build back better, to ensure that all children have access to quality education and safer, more equitable learning environments, and that we use schools to interrupt long-standing cycles of violence. And this year, at this moment, crucial conversations are happening in various global fora. We just had the G7 and the recent declaration on girls' education as a priority for pandemic recovery and achieving the 2030 agenda, Generation Equality Forum and the action coalitions around the corner, the Global Partnership for Education's new strategy, which puts girls and gender equality at the heart of the education sector priorities, and the upcoming Replenishment Conference, and finally, the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children's Solutions Summit and Safe to Learn. All of these conversations are happening right now. And today, we're really delighted to be with all of you to contribute to these bigger conversations and to explore how we can help end gender-based violence in and through schools. And so with that, I hope you're ready for the exciting program we have. I want to start by introducing Leslie McLean, who is the Deputy Minister of International Development for Global Affairs Canada.
Hello, bonjour. I'm pleased to express Canada's support for the important work of Together for Girls to use data to drive action and advocacy to end violence against children. I'm proud to speak to Canada's commitment on education and gender-based violence, of course, the challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the key role of data in overcoming these challenges and advancing our shared goals. In 2018, Canada and the G7 committed to support quality education and lifelong learning for girls, adolescent girls, and women through the Charlevoix Declaration. Our approach is not only to improve the quality of education, but also to address gender-based violence as a key barrier to girls' education. I'm so proud to speak to our work with Together for Girls, our longstanding and trusted partner since 2014. It's really been vital in delivering on our Charlevoix commitment. Please join me in recognizing the work of Together for Girls to better document the relationship between sexual and gender-based violence and education outcomes. We're supporting this work through the Data for Change project to allow us to identify country-specific barriers to education, a critical step to mobilize resources and to implement solutions. With a clearer picture of the violence girls and boys experience, we can understand the protection gaps and then design and implement interventions to make sure children of all ages are able to live free of violence inside and outside the classroom. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has set us all back in achieving our shared goals. We know of the shadow pandemic of increased violence against women and girls, driven by confinement, school closures, additional economic pressures, and the disruption of aid programs. This has only highlighted how important schools are in preventing violence. We also know that the pandemic is having a disproportionate effect on girls' education, who are less likely than boys to return to school once we have reopening because of the increased burden of care work, increased sexual and gender-based violence, early and forced child marriage, and adolescent pregnancies. This data is going to be critical to driving our COVID responses to address health impacts, but of course also to support children and their families to cope with the school closures, keep learning from home, and go back to school safely when the time is right. Again, please join me in thanking Together for Girls for their work to generate data to help us understand how we best preserve the hard-fought gains we have made and also build back with more resilience. This will make sure that all girls have access to quality, safe learning environments and are able to live free of violence. We are grateful to Together for Girls, survivors, and allies who are contributing to addressing these challenges and finding solutions. Together, let's keep working toward a more equitable and violence-free world. Merci.
Thank you so much to Deputy Minister. We appreciate your kind words. Now I am excited to get our panel started. Again, as a reminder for those of you who just joined, if you want to see the full bios, there is a link in the chat. I'm going to do very brief introductions and just noting we do have two separate panels. And so this first panel is really going to focus a little bit more around data and evidence, and then we're going to talk about scaling solutions. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Jones, who is the Deputy Director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Prevention and Control Injury Center, the CDC, Dr. Chloe Favre, who is Director of Safe to Learn Global Initiative, Deepak Nacker, who is co-founder and co-director of Raising Voices, and Sophie Sandberg, who is an activist and founder of Chalkback. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today on our panel. All right, so Chris, if I may, shall we start with you? Can you tell us a little bit more about the violence against children and youth surveys that the CDC leads on around the world as part of the broader Together for Girls partnership, and what information they provide and how they're implemented?
Sure, and thanks, Danielle. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to the event today and for our longstanding partnership to advance violence prevention globally. And I know this is certainly something that is known among this audience, but it certainly is worth repeating that violence affects more than 1 billion children a year, more than half of the world's children. And those impacts reverberate throughout the lifespan and extend into families, communities, and impact nations. But we know that violence can be prevented. And certainly from our perspective at CDC and the public health perspective is that a critical first step in figuring out what we need to do is having data to understand how often does violence occur? Where does it happen? What are risk factors and who is most vulnerable? And really without that information, we can't effectively implement policies, programs, or practices to prevent violence and its impacts. And that's why VAX, or the Violence Against Children and Youth surveys, are really so powerful as the global standard for looking at prevalence and burden of violence against children and youth. It really does capture information that is essential to guiding data-driven prevention efforts. And for those of you who are not familiar with VAX, to date, we have completed or in progress to complete 25 surveys in 23 countries around the world. And VAX captures representative data on the experiences throughout childhood and into adolescence and young adulthood, yielding estimates of lifetime and recent experiences of violence. But it also captures the circumstances surrounding violence, risk and protective factors, the consequences of violence, including risk behaviors and health outcomes, and provides really rich data on the relationship between education, schools, and violence. And while the survey itself is very compelling and a very rich data source, I think what is most impactful is the intentionality behind the survey. It's not that we're just randomly doing a survey, but that really baked into the process is political buy-in, stakeholder engagement, and a commitment to use these data to inform how we should advance violence prevention efforts for young people. And at CDC, we are certainly very honored to be a key partner in providing technical assistance and capacity building around conducting the survey, and then how do we use those data to drive action? And there certainly are many examples where countries have done this. And I think what's so remarkable is that it really may be the first time that a country really understands in a representative way the prevalence of violence, how pervasive it can be, certainly among certain populations, and then really helping to inform, okay, so what is it that we need to do if we really want to make progress here? And I just want to briefly provide an example of Kenya as an experience with VAX. In 2010, the government of Kenya released results from their first VAX. And really, again, that whole process of data to action. And a decade later, they conducted a second survey, which really provided an opportunity to say, here's where we were a decade ago. We've done these things to address violence. Now let's survey where it stands in our country. And what the second survey showed is that there was a significant reduction in every form of violence against children over the 10-year period between the two surveys. That the prevalence of childhood sexual violence was reduced in half for females and by almost by 2/3 for males. And the prevalence of physical violence also decreased among both females and males. And it's just, it's just one snapshot into the power of the survey to help drive action, and then to go back and say, what did we get for the work that we've done?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, and that helps to create this story of hope, right? That actually there is something you can do about it, and then you can track and measure that progress, which is so important when it comes to this issue. Let's go over to Chloe now. Chloe, tell us a little bit more about Safe to Learn and the broader initiative that is Safe to Learn, and how you are leveraging the power of partnership, because this really needs to be around everyone coming together. It's an issue that's magnitude is so large, right? So tell us a little bit about how you're doing that.
Sure, I would be very happy to, Daniela. And again, also, just echoing what Chris said, echoing the value that we give to the partnership with Together for Girls and the admiration about the VACs and all the contribution of Together for Girls. So in terms of the Safe to Learn initiative, I think, if we all have the same vision in terms of ending violence against children and gender-based violence in particular, we first need to listen to their voices, to the voices of girls and boys. And a couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago now, in 2018, there was a big survey of more than 1 million young people, girls and boys, who actually said that violence was a big concern, a big worry, and that the global community actually needed to put this issue as top of its priority if we wanted to provide safe learning environments and a better future for all of them. And so based on this very clear declaration, 2 out of 3 of these young people, more than 1 million again, said that, like, you need to pay attention to violence in and around schools and how to prevent it to ensure safe learning environments. Then a global coalition of partners, 14 big partners out there, joined forces and decided to come together to really highlight and increase the visibility and the prioritization of violence prevention within education. So among the 14, I won't go through all the lists, so forgive me, but just, to highlight a little bit the diversity of the partnership as well. So we have the big, UN agency who have tons of expertise on working on violence against children and violence and GBV in particular, like Ungai, who is with us today. We have UNICEF, UNESCO, WHO that has been leading on violence prevention for decades now. We have also, financiers of education, like GAG, who has given, the first welcoming talk at the beginning of this event. We have also UKFCDO, the World Bank, big financiers that are actually trying to accelerate learning in different countries. And so working with them help us to make sure that what's going on in terms of education finances also as a safe lens into it. And then we have the CSO Forum, and Deepak is here, from the Global Coalition for Good Schools and many other civil society organizations that are part of the CSO Forum that are with us, helping us to actually, ground whatever we're doing, our strategy to make sure that we have strong practitioners around the table and also the expertise at the global and national level. And then we have the private sector. We have, other organizations like ECW, the GPE that you mentioned, Daniela, many big players in both education and violence prevention, child protection and health, really coming together because, as you said very rightly, if we want really to have this goal of ending violence against children and GBV in particular by 2030, we need to do it together. And we need to have complementary skills, both understanding how education works and how, what the data and what the evidence in terms of preventing different forms of violence in and around schools.
Fantastic.
So it's what Safe to Learn is about.
And it takes a village, right? It really does to do this kind of work. And it's intersectoral work, multi-sectoral work, which is oftentimes challenging. So to have that space is so important. This is a great transition to Deepak because, Chloe was just talking about evidence-based programming to prevent and respond to violence. And, you all at Raising Voices have done so much to show what it looks like to use evidence to then create a difference in the lives of children, adolescents, women, communities. So can you tell us a little bit more? We know that children are experiencing violence at home, in their community, and also at school. So why is school an important entry point for intervention?
Thank you, Daniela. First, let me just begin by thanking Together for Girls for putting this event together. I think it's so important to bring attention to the issue of how work through schools can really have an impact. And I really rely on the work that Chris was talking about and definitely what Chloe is talking about with Safe to Learn Initiative. Safe to Learn Initiative has only been around for 3 years, but is already making waves out there. So I'm really happy to be in this company. So to address your question, why did we choose schools as opposed to, we have work that is going on at a community level in homes, but why is school in some ways our flagship? And there are 3 kind of broad reasons I want to give you quickly. First is just access. That, like you were saying, more than 1 billion children are expected at school on any given school day. So it's as if we are calling a large meeting on any given school day, and we're not putting our issue on the agenda of that meeting. Yeah. So there's just a huge opportunity there in terms of influencing large numbers of childhood in a fairly efficient manner in terms of addressing this issue. The second point I want to make is that we have a mandate at school, in the sense that teachers have duty of care, and that in some ways there is already built into the structure of school a transaction about how can we influence for the positive a child's experience of childhood. And then the third reason I want to give you is that there are multiple levels at which this makes sense. Yeah? That everyone, from a parent to teachers to policymakers, believes that a school is our highest repository of aspirations. That's where we have our biggest aspirations as a community. So to, in some ways, enhance those aspirations, it makes strategic sense, it makes moral sense to, in some ways, design interventions that address the experience of children at school, because the outcomes have implications in every sphere of a child's life and the community's life. And you know, at the end of the day, I would say everyone's life, because ultimately we determine what kind of citizens we introduce to our community. So for all those reasons, I think schools are a really strategic entry points for preventing violence against children or gender-based violence.
Absolutely. And just such amazing work that you all are doing over there at Raising Voices. Let's go over to Sophie, and really to start to think, I mean, a couple of people have mentioned evidence and interventions, and you were talking, Deepak, about this entry point. But an important thing to consider is kind of, are there innovative ways to bring attention to the lived experiences of, you know, children, adolescents, youth, students, who are, you know, so powerful in terms of raising awareness around the issues they're experiencing in their day-to-day lives in school. And so tell us a little bit about Chalkback and how you're using innovative ways to bring attention to the issue of sexual violence and harassment in schools.
Absolutely. And just to echo again what everyone else has mentioned, I'm so grateful to be here. It's been amazing to listen to the other remarks, and I'm just so grateful to be in this space. So Chalkback is a little bit different. We're a global youth-led movement that uses chalk art and social media to raise awareness about lived experiences of gender-based harassment and gender-based violence. So we solicit lived experiences. We have 150 activists around the world on 6 continents using Instagram and social media to actually solicit people's experiences of gender-based violence and gender-based harassment in and around schools. So what we do with these stories, we share them out on social media, and we actually chalk them in public spaces. We write them in colorful chalk on the streets near schools so that they're actually accessible and they can reach people more easily. So something that we've noticed with data around school-related gender-based violence and gender-based harassment and gender-based violence in general is that it might not be accessible to the students who we're trying to reach. Whereas through Instagram and through chalk art and through these really youth-centered approaches, we're able to reach all sorts of students with our stories. So that's something that's really exciting about Chalkback. For those of you who are on social media, I've noticed in the chat box that you're from all over the world. We have different Instagram sites all over the world. So feel free to check out Chalkback.org on Instagram, and you can see the work we're doing and how we're raising awareness and educating on these issues.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And really the combination of like data, interventions, partnerships, but then lived experience and youth movements coming together to really, you know, create change when it comes to this issue is so important. It really does take the various pieces of the puzzle. Chris, I'm going to get back to you. Tell us a little bit more about kind of, you described the breadth, magnitude, and depth of the VACS, the Violence Against Children and Youth surveys, but tell us a little bit more about how they've been used to understand this relationship between violence in and around schools and also outcomes.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the powerful things about VACS is that because there is sort of consistency in the data and the data collection, We can certainly analyze data within a country to understand what's going on, but we can also pool data to understand where there's similarities, where there's differences, and increase our ability to identify risk and protective factors. And as I mentioned, because the data source is rich, it has that contextual information around where violence occurs, but also educational attainment and level of educational attainment. So you really can dig into the connection between violence and education. And we have worked with you guys and with Canada as well to do some analyses to really further explore the connection between modifier risk and protective factors in educational outcomes using data, VAX data from 12 countries. And as you mentioned, there were some really important findings in that analysis that really prompt us to think about our goals in wanting to advance education and the importance of education, but recognizing the importance of ensuring that schools in the school setting are safe environments. And what we found in the analysis, and really contrary to what people might expect, is that females who remained in school longer had higher risk of certain types of violence compared to those who did not remain in school. And so for those who only completed primary school, compared to those who completed secondary school, those who completed secondary school had higher odds of sexual violence, witnessing violence in the community, and lower likelihood of things like physical violence by an intimate partner, child marriage, early sexual debut, and pregnancy. There were also differences between males who had completed secondary school versus those who only completed primary school. So I think it reinforces the idea that as we pursue strategies to ensure education and access to education, in particular for females, for girls, that we have to ensure that the environment is safe and supportive. And I think that the power of VAX is that it can help to hone in on what types of violence, who are the perpetrators of that violence, how might you need to tailor your interventions to get at a safe school environment and to help address those particular issues that are informed by the data. It's not anecdote, it's not assumption, it is hard data to help drive policies. We've also looked at sort of the gender dynamics of violence and corporal punishment in schools. Again, another sort of power of using the VAX data. And again, the VAX findings specific to school settings and school-related perpetrators reinforce our understanding that violence in school settings is often gendered. For example, male students are consistently more likely to both perpetrate and experience physical violence, whereas female students experience higher rates of sexual violence. So it is, again, an opportunity to be as granular as we can in understanding where are the intervention opportunities, where are the risk factors, what can we do to strengthen protective factors and promote resilience within the school setting as we all collectively work towards the goal of school access and educational attainment for all of the benefits that we've already talked about that resonate throughout the lifespan.
Thanks so much, Chris, and really bringing that to light in terms of looking at that. For those of you that are interested, I think someone just put it in the chat. We have a whole page on our website where we have a lot of these recent analyses and studies that Chris is mentioning that do offer quite an interesting perspective, and some of them done with many of the partners on this call, on this webinar. So it's a team effort. So let's go over to you, Chloe. Tell us a little bit more about kind of solutions. So Chris is talking about really understanding the ecosystem, the problem in depth, but then you need to pair that with, well, what are the solutions? So how is Safe to Learn focusing on evidence-based solutions to address both gender inequality, but also school-related gender-based violence?
Sure. I mean, I would say that the first step is to acknowledge that any kind of violence has gender inequality as a root cause. Like when we're talking about violence, we're talking about unequal power dynamics and the use or abuse of power over someone else, a child, a girl, a boy, another person. And so these unequal power dynamics are always gendered. And so just beginning by acknowledging and using the data to show it, help us, make it then translating in terms of programming. And so what we see is girls and boys have, different, are affected by different forms of violence, depending on the age groups, etc., as Chris was mentioning. And it's very important to have these data to actually make visible what has been for too long invisible in the education sector, because we didn't have these data to really document it. Now we have it. And again, as Chris said, it gives us entry points to be able to mitigate the risk factors for the different forms of violence that are impacting girls and boys. And so us at Safe to Learn, what we do is actually to try to put all these knowledge together and operationalize it in terms of a collective methodology for action at the country level, at the country and at the global level. But at the country level, it's very important to speak the language of education, because ultimately what we want is to transform education system to make sure that all girls and boys are safe. They're safe to go to school, they're safe to learn, they're safe, even now they're safe online when they learn, they're safe at home. It's a continuum of violence, and we need to build up the continuum of prevention that responds to it. And so we bring, the analysis, the evidence that all the researchers and the partners that, have devoted decades, building up. And we have right now a solid base of evidence in terms of what works to prevent different forms of violence at different age groups. It can be stronger, it can be bigger, but we do know enough to act. And there is also a different type of knowledge and different types of evidence that is extremely relevant. We have a beautiful body of qualitative research that is extremely also relevant in terms of programming. So we use that, and then we try to find the synergies within education to see what education is already doing and improving it with a safe lens based on the evidence that is available. And so it's really merging the two, because learning, and you mentioned at the beginning, the crisis, the learning crisis, and all the different crises that, that are the consequences of the COVID-19 on the life of children. And the learning crisis is certainly an enormous one. But it's very important to think about that if we want to improve learning and that all the girls and boys can learn, we need to pair it with safe learning environments. They go together. You cannot think about one without the other. Yeah. And so for that, it's not a blind programming, it's really using what we know and adapting it so that it becomes totally integrated and mainstreamed within education.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that takes us right back to you, Deepak, and this idea of kind of from the big global level to really on the ground experience implementing one such evidence-based intervention that Raising Voices has been doing, which is the Good Schools Toolkit. So can you tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing there to address both gender inequality and violence in schools?
Thank you. I want to begin by just underlining what Chloe just said, and then kind of address the question what you're raising. Is I really think that it is really important and bears repeating that the education sector needs to own the problem of violence against children at school. Yeah, a lot of the time, people who are working in the education sector are focused on learning outcomes and teacher skills and classroom sizes and so forth. Yeah, and yet what I hear Chloe say, and what our experience has been, is that if we don't pay attention to how children experience school on a day-to-day basis, and violence has profound implication on that, then in some ways we are undermining the whole enterprise. But now coming back to the intervention, the Good School Toolkit began with the question that we were facing in Uganda, that Uganda had introduced a legislation, policy guidelines, that school corporal punishment was prohibited in schools years ago. And yet the violence was continuing in schools unabated. Yeah, VAX data has shown that, our own internal study has shown that more than 50% of children were saying that they experienced it last week. So our question was, why is it continuing despite these policy guidelines? And ultimately, through a series of conversations, what we realized is that the systems that people are embedded in profoundly influence how they experience whatever they're embedded in. And so the system of school is what we needed to address. Yeah? And the system of school is made up by the nature of governance that the school has in place, the nature of relationships teachers create with students, the nature of relationships students create with each other, the nature of involvement that parents have with school, and so forth. And all of that collectively, we are calling the operational culture of school. And so that's what we set out to address. How do we address the operational culture of school? And we devised through iterative measures. So we've been doing this for 10, 12 years. We started with a set of ideas and we've been refining them. And we've developed almost 60 to 70 activities that addresses these different facets of the operational culture. And then we've organized that into a 6-step process so that it's not just haphazard 70 activities that you do, but you sequence them so that they build one on top of another, on top of another. And so we developed this intervention that we are now calling Good School Toolkit, and we started implementing it, and now it's in 1,000 schools. And this year we're working with the Ministry of Education to take it to 5,000 schools to implement it at scale. Yeah. So in some ways, it's evolved over a period of 12 to 15 years with refinement and with active involvement of the government of Uganda, by the way.
Sorry, I'm muted. Just to note, thank you for that, Deepak. It is one of the interventions that's actually been rigorously evaluated, which I know is something you take very seriously to show that impact, which is so important in our space, right? So that you can have good ideas, but you continue to, you know, perfect them and test them and evaluate them to see what the impact is. Let me go now to a final question for you, Sophie. And really, you know, I said this at the beginning, but we often think about data and evidence as something that's very quantitative, hard numbers, statistics, but this idea of lived experience, this idea of kind of other kinds of data to inform what we do is so important. Tell us more about kind of how you're expanding the idea of what is data and evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great question. So with Chalkback, like I mentioned before, what we're doing is collecting stories and firsthand experiences. And many of the activists who are involved in Chalkback are actually teenagers themselves or young people themselves. They might be students in high school or young adults who have a close association with still being in school. So what we're able to do is really mobilize young people who are even experiencing being in school or who have just experienced being in school and are actually able to, you know, fight back in a way against the violence that is happening in schools that they know how, by using social media, by sharing firsthand experiences, and by also using colorful street art. So that's been something that we're able to do with Chalkback. In general, data is really important. It kind of gives a broad scope of a problem. And then what I see us doing with Chalkback is kind of filling in that data. So data is kind of the broad spectrum, and then we're able to fill in the nuances of people's experiences by sharing their firsthand stories and what has happened to them. I think that's something that's also really important, is that since gender-based violence is so normalized in schools around the world, oftentimes girls who report their stories to us might not recognize that they're facing gender-based violence. So if you give them a statistic and say X amount of girls face gender-based violence in schools, they might not recognize that they're part of that statistic or feel comfortable sharing their story after that. Whereas with Chalkback, if we tell them someone else's story, you know, this happened to someone, they were touched inappropriately or something like that, then they're able to open up and see their own experience in that story and build a sense of community and solidarity. So that's really central to the work that Chalkback members are doing. We're using youth-centered and youth-led solutions to raise awareness about gender-based violence that is happening in schools. Yeah.
And Sophie, this issue is so important, right? The normalization of violence, so many people have talked about, but also this sense of feeling very isolated and the shame and there's something about community, right? When you can begin to understand that you're not alone. And it goes back to your point, Deepak, around systems, right? These are systems where you know, huge numbers of children and adolescents continue to have the same experiences. It's not one-offs. So there's such power in that. We are, of course, a little over time because this was so interesting, but I do want to get one of the questions from the audience. There were several, but I'm going to throw one out to whomever wants to answer this one. And it is really about how do we kind of engage and work with ministries at a government level to make sure that they're using data and evidence to address school-related gender-based violence. So does anyone have any thoughts on that? I'm pointing to you. You can't see it because you don't know where I am on the screen. Deepak.
So we have worked quite closely with Ministry of Education in Uganda. And so the first thing I want to say is that if you're going to work with ministry, you have to recognize that it's a long haul. You can't be expecting results tomorrow or in short time span. And so you have to go in with that resilience built into it. The second thing I would want to say is that the ministry is usually a huge bureaucratic place, and there are lots of people with it. So you have to find allies within ministries, and there are some really good people who really want to make a difference, who really want to use their position to make change. Those are the people you have to find and help them look good in front of their colleagues. So you have to give them data, you have to give them all sorts of strategies that they can use in their spaces to bring about the change that you're collectively wanting to bring. And then the third and final point I would want to make around ministry is that it's really important that you feed to the key allies that you have in ministry information that they can use. Yeah, it's no good sending them huge reports and saying, here, read this, because they're busy people, they've got many things going. You have to make information digestible and then help them construct an argument in terms of how they will use to persuade all the other people that also need persuasion. But it's a strategic thing. It takes stamina and it's slow moving, but without them, you really can't go anywhere.
Absolutely. Chloe, is that your hand? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just 1 minute. I know we're out of time, but definitely fully agreed with all that Deepak said. But in addition to that, I think we need to speak first with one voice among ourselves. So using the same narrative, using the same data, trying to show what, again and again, how it impacts education. And two, understand the problematic from their point of view, meaning that the main objective is learning outcomes. They want the kids to learn. If we show that violence actually negatively impact learning outcomes, then we get their attention much more powerfully. And it's really trying to use the data to showcase that, and then show that we have solutions to actually, make the learning environment much stronger, much safer, so that the girls and boys can learn.
Absolutely. Well, listen, with that, I wish we had a lot more time for conversation, but I also see in the chat, there's a ton of conversation happening. It's so interesting. Like, that's a plus of these online events, is that people are kind of engaging and talking to each other as well. Deep thanks to all of our amazing panelists and all the work that you do to end gender-based violence in and through schools. And with that, we are going to transition over and hear from an amazing champion, Alice Albright, who is the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education, and has really made sure that with this new strategy that the GP has released, the issue of safety, and especially when it comes to girls, is front and center. Over to Alice.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here today with our partners who are working so tirelessly to make our schools and communities safer. We gather here to discuss the staggering increase in violence against children, especially girls, evidenced by the documented rise in child marriage and physical and sexual violence due in part to COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdowns. We cannot accept this shadow pandemic of violence and must work to counteract the effects on all children, especially the most marginalized and most vulnerable. We all know that schools provide far more than just a space for learning. They are a safe space with access to important social connections, daily meals, and critical health services. While much of the world is still grappling with COVID-19, we are beginning to see the process of schools reopening in some parts of the world. In doing so, we must also recognize that for many children, school is not a safe place. Over half of the world's children have experienced violence, specifically gender-based violence in and around school. Girls are more likely to experience psychological bullying, cyberbullying, sexual violence, and harassment, while boys face higher rates of physical violence, including corporal punishment. All of this is unacceptable. We must take action to eliminate school-related gender-based violence, otherwise known as Srgbv. This means working across sectors to build an ecosystem of laws, policies, and institutional support that puts gender equality at the center and keeps children safe from violence. A successful systems approach to address Srgbv requires that we take 3 actions. First, start by accurately diagnosing the problem, identifying underlying root causes and key bottlenecks, including the gender stereotypes and power imbalances that breed inequality and violence. Second, that we align all stakeholders involving educational leaders, teachers, parents, and communities in the critical work of reforming policies and establishing effective response mechanisms that build shared momentum and accelerate progress. Third, we must act on evidence, which means implementing and enforcing solutions and frameworks that are based on strong information that will allow us to work effectively and ensure that every dollar is wisely spent. It is by harnessing the transformational power of education to shift harmful norms and build safe learning environments that we can eradicate Srgbv. At GPE, we are working with our country partners to build education systems that can address Srgbv. In Togo, GPE is supporting pre-service training that includes a training module on preventing and addressing school-related gender-based violence. And in Mozambique, we are promoting communication between schools and parents to ensure that students have psychosocial support that they need to help prevent gender-based violence. We will be stepping up this work under our new strategy, GPE 2025, and supporting national governments to help make schools safer and more inclusive, including through systematically monitoring violence and safety. It all starts in the classroom. When our schools are safer, parents feel more confident sending their children to school. When our schools are safer, children stay in schools. When children stay in schools that do not tolerate violence, they are empowered to challenge gender stereotypes and negative social norms in their lives, their families, and their communities. That is how we will have a lasting impact at scale and permanently stamp out Srgbv in our communities and across the world. 2021 is a year of big moments, including GPE's Global Education Summit, which will be hosted by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the President of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, in London on July 28th and 29th. This will be a big moment for all of GPE's supporters to make ambitious commitments to gender equality and preventing gender-based violence through education. Let us commit as a global community to transforming education and addressing school violence so that all children learn in safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice. As always, she's such a champion for these issues, and we're so excited to see the new GPE strategy come out, really going deeper into this issue of school-related gender-based violence. It is now my pleasure to move over to our next panel, where we have a focus on really scaling solutions. We talked a lot about data and evidence, that first piece, but how do we make that a reality? And I am delighted to have with us several amazing panelists. I do want to just flag once again that if you want to see their full bios, that is in the chat. But we have Liana Mar, who is the acting Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Development, Democracy, and Innovation at USAID. We also have Antara Ganguly, who is Director of Ungai, the UN Girls Education Initiative. Martha Mwezi, who is Executive Director of FAWE. and Eileen Menchutui, who is co-chair of the Srgbv Working Collective and also at Las Niñas Lidera. So with that, let's get this panel started. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us today. It's such an honor. And I want to start with you, Liana. Tell us a little bit about kind of the top line highlights in terms of USAID's kind of expansive education sector work and how gender is really tied into the work that you're doing within education at USAID.
Great. Well, thank you so much. First of all, I'm very excited to be here. It's such a wonderful opportunity to hear about work of all these other great organizations. I'd also just like to start out by recognizing how fortunate USAID has been to partner with organizations like Together for Girls, CDC, the College of William and Mary, Ungai, and others to further work around school-based gender violence. This partnership has helped us really better understand violence's impact on educational outcomes, and it really makes all of our programming stronger. So really together we are stronger and better. At USAID, we know that education is transformational, and I believe this can be particularly true for marginalized populations, including girls, women, and gender and sexual minorities. USAID invests in the education system in more than 50 countries, from pre-primary to higher education. We assist countries to provide education opportunities for all children and youth. In all of this work, we continue to put gender equality and girls' education at the forefront of our policies. Recently, and actually on only her second day in the position, Administrator Power noted last month in her remarks to the G7 ministerial meeting on sustainable recovery that USAID wants to build on our long history of creating better access to quality education, particularly for young girls, because we all know that girls' access to education is one of the most powerful forces for driving economic development, prosperity, and security. At the same time, Administrator Power also underscored that when we talk about gender, we need to be sure that we are thinking beyond the male-female binary. We need to be inclusive and welcoming of all forms of gender expression, both in our language and in our programming. And I think it's really important for us to keep this in mind when we're working on gender-based violence. It's extremely important to recognize that programs and interventions need to be inclusive of men, boys, and gender and sexual minorities. We know that girls are victims, but we also know that there are other populations that experience gender-based violence. And in fact, some studies are showing that LGBTQI students may be subject to higher levels of school-related gender-based violence, and they also report higher levels of bullying. With the Biden-Harris administration, we are renewing efforts to advance LGBTQI+ inclusion in the education sector, and we're working to have more discussions and guidance on how we can effectively, safely, and meaningfully integrate considerations of gender and sexual minorities into our programming. Please keep your eye out for more information and discussions in the near future. I think it's worth noting that literally within the first few weeks of taking office, President Biden signed an executive order to establish the White House Gender Policy Council. This council will coordinate and launch a government-wide strategy to advance gender equity and equality in the United States and around the world. USAID is proud to sit on the Gender Policy Council, and it will help to inform and guide our work. And I actually really think it will help to amplify our efforts. The US government's strategy on international basic education works across the US government to increase access to quality education, particularly for the most marginalized and vulnerable groups like women and girls and gender and sexual minorities. The USAID education policy puts forth a commitment to inclusion, equity, safety, and quality across all of its educational investments. And of course, as we've heard from other speakers, the impacts of COVID-19 have been unprecedented and really has taken us back years in some of the work we've been doing, especially around equity. Because of COVID-19, this moment in global education is pivotal. We know that it's having negative impacts and continues to have negative impacts, disproportionately impacting the most marginalized population, including girls. I'm really proud of the fact that despite the pandemic, USAID reached more than 24 million children at the primary and secondary levels in 2020, providing millions of learners with access to education, half of whom were girls and young women. Building back better will require a focus on building resilient education systems and also to double down on the work we've been doing to reach the most marginalized, especially women, girls, those with disabilities, gender and sexual minorities, and also children in crisis and conflict who experience just really unparalleled levels of violence. The COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately impacted the learning of women and girls, as one example in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In response, USAID and FCDO's joint Acceler activity worked with the DRC Ministry of Education to launch an interactive radio instruction program in local languages, reaching approximately 114,000 learners and empowering many women and girls to continue their education during the pandemic. This program included messaging campaigns to encourage parents not to increase girls' domestic burdens and to support their radio lessons. It also provided training on gender inclusion and school-related gender-based violence prevention. And I think this is really important, that we really need to look at taking multi-pronged approaches when trying to combat gender-based violence. We need to look at the policy and national level of building up the skills of ministries of education and governments, but we also have to work with community-based NGOs, with families. So again, it really we need to kind of wrap support around at all different levels. I could keep talking about this, but I think I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you so much, Liana, and just really amazing to see this administration's leadership on these issues. And I do want to just reiterate something so important you said, which is we need to be more sophisticated about how we think about gender and think about gender expansive youth, gender identity, sexual orientation. We also need to think about not only the gender of victims, but the gender of perpetrators and that relationship when it comes to violence, as well as acknowledging that, for example, sometimes we say through our data, we find girls experience more sexual violence, but boys are still experiencing unacceptably high levels of sexual violence. So how do we take all that into account is really important. Thank you for that. Let me move over to Antara. And I know, Antara, you have, feels to me like recently, but it probably not that recently, because time is warped right now, taken over Ungai's leadership. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Ungai is working to improve the availability of data and evidence-based solutions to prevent and respond to school-related gender-based violence?
Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you to all my colleagues who have spoken before and the really, really great ideas and discussion that's happening in the chat. It's such a pleasure for us to be here today. I'm Antara from Ungai. I'll answer your question quickly because I think I'd like to surface a couple of issues where we all need to do more work. So Ungai is a global advocacy platform and partnership for girls' education, but also gender equality in education. And I think that latter piece is particularly relevant to this conversation. We work on data and evidence in a few different ways. Firstly, we advocate at all the diverse fora that we are part of on data, on prevalence data on violence, sex and age disaggregated data, everywhere that we work with governments and other education actors. We work quite deeply in many education spaces in developing countries, so we really advocate for this information over there. Secondly, in leading with UNESCO, the global working group on Srgb, we've developed something called the whole of school approach to preventing and responding to Srgb. And that comes with some very interesting indicators to measure prevalence, which are not difficult to do and do not require a very sophisticated Ministry of Statistics approach to it. Third, this working group also has a task team on measurement, and they're doing some really cutting edge work there, and looking forward to sharing that with you as it comes out. Fourth, we incubate and support an organization called Transform Education. They are the transformers of the gender equality in education space. Eileen today is part of that, and they're a group of young feminist activists from around the world who advocate for issues of gender equality in education. So this is what Ungai does. I just want to add that I think one area, listening to all of you, I think we have come a long way in recognizing the gendered origins of violence. And, you know, to hear Dr. Chloe say that so clearly as the head of Safe to Learn really felt like a fantastic milestone to me, coming from the intersection of GBV and education and children. So let's recognize that we've moved a long way to bring those together. I do think we can do a lot more to put at the center of our work harmful gender norms and helping children, students, teachers, the entire school ecosystem to really question the norms that lead to abusive behavior, whether it is sexual violence against girls or boys, or using a term like fag as a form of bullying. You know, if you think about the word fag, it's really sort of a comment on making masculinity a very narrow performance for boys, and it leads to trauma for many boys, but also transgender children. So I think the next step in our journey is also around looking at how we can do more to not just link at a conceptual level the work on gender-based violence and violence against children within schools and around schools, but also how we can use the space of schools, use the curricula, use the pedagogy, use the mandatory in-service training and the orientation of teachers, which every government does provide for, to really raise questions on harmful gender stereotypes that leads to violence.
Absolutely. And we are progressing, and there's so many of these deep questions to think about, and the space that school provides to be able to do that and to change those norms, right? Yeah, let me move over now to you, Martha. And I just want to start by acknowledging that, you know, the African Forum for Women Educationalists and your leadership in terms of really tackling some of these tough issues and being at the forefront of making those changes in those communities, working with those who are on the ground most impacted. Just phenomenal work that FAWA has been doing. For those of you that don't know FAWA, someone should put their website in the chat and people should go take a look. But tell us a little, Martha, about how FAWA is working to address the issue of quality education for girls and also the issue of school-related gender-based violence.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela, and thanks to all those that are participating into this discussion. I also want to thank Together for Girls for putting this together. Like Daniela mentions, we are a Pan-African organization, and by that level, we operate both at the national and at regional level. And in all this, we operate through the 33 chapters that we have across the continent. And working at national and regional level, most of our work is promoting gender responsive and quality education for girls. And at the same time, we come up with interventions that address school-related gender-based violence. And when I talk about the Pan-African level, that's the FAWA at the regional level. We do a lot of advocacy. We do partnership with like-minded organizations. We scale up what has worked and what has proved to be a means to promoting girls' education. We also do the sharing and learning, which is a result of documentation of what has worked. FAWA has been in existence for the last 29 years. And for all these years, a lot has happened. And therefore, we work towards scaling up and also sharing it to ensure that all the other people learn from, all the other organizations as well learn from what has worked. And I just mentioned very quickly in terms of what exactly happens and how we do our work, both at national and regional level. One is through research. We've done a lot of research, and this was right from the inception and through the implementation period up to current. And this research made us unearth or understand barriers to girls' challenges in education, looking at access, retention, completion, and transition levels. These informed the programming and the evidence that has been that has emerged from the research has supported both the chapters at country level to be able to plan in terms of addressing those issues, the barriers that stop girls from getting into school and keeping in school. These are issues to do with the early pregnancies, forced marriages, and the issues of FGM. Those are some of the harmful cultural practices that FAWE works towards addressing, because all these lead to girls not benefiting from school. And the other is also, like I mentioned, is through the demonstrative interventions. When we do research and we realize there are issues of early pregnancies, the next step is to come up with interventions that are able to solve or intervene in addressing some of those challenges. And some of them include, for instance, building capacities for teachers. That's the gender responsive pedagogy, for teachers to teach from a gender responsive angle, to support or to understand the issues of girls, the issues of boys, and be able to support them as they get in school. The other is, we've had a model, which is tuseme. It's a Swahili word, but means speaking out. And this is a model that does not only focus on working for girls, but building the capacities of the girls and boys to be able to advocate for their own rights. It builds their self-esteem, it builds their leadership skills, it gives them skills to positively think about themselves and also accepting the fact that they can be as good as the boys. So this is one of the models that FAWE has implemented over the years. There is the comprehensive scholarship program. These are many girls that are very bright, very intelligent, but they are not able to get into school. And this has been one of the ways to get these girls in school and support them in all aspects. There is also the technical vocational training. These are girls that have dropped out of school, maybe because of pregnancy, because of forced marriages. When they get back to school, when they are willing to go back to school, but they may not fit within the normal curriculum. And therefore, we've promoted TVET. And as we promote TVET, we also look at it from the gender perspective to ensure that the environment is conducive. STEM is also one way we've done, in promoting girls' education. STEM has for a long time been looked at as a male domain, but over the years, it has been proved that girls can get into STEM and they can perform very well. And in most cases, they have performed even better than the boys. And so this has been one way of encouraging the girls to get into the STEM model. But as we do this, we all look at it from the gender perspective in terms of making learning more interesting, more encouraging to the girls, so that they change their attitude, which they have taken on over the time, taking STEM as a male domain. So those are some of the ways that, all the practices that FAWE has implemented over the years. And in addition to that, advocacy is very key in all that we do, because as we come up with those interventions, scaling up, we have to do a lot of advocacy with ministries and all other key partners to be able to implement what works for girls' education. So in brief, that is what we've done in terms of promoting. Thank you.
And I'm really struck by, the work that you've done. There's an advocacy level, there's a kind of training of teachers, and then there's the work with the kids directly, and all those pieces complement each other, right? And are so important. Really great. And that actually is a good transition over to you, Eileen. Bienvenida. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I know that Las Niñas is very engaged in one of the events that we talked about that's coming up, and that is Generation Equality. So can you tell us a little bit about how you're engaging in that space, and how maybe you're thinking about the issues also of gender-based violence in and around schools? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a honor to be here with these colleagues, and I really admire all the work that you're doing. Well, Las Niñas Lideran, or Let Girls Lead, is a program of Rise Up and the network that we have here in Quetzaltenango, Guatemala. We have been working for a long time because we work to create a better future for the girls of Guatemala, of Latin America, and for the world. And I have been working with Las Niñas Lideran for 5 years, and having this opportunity and this space in Generation Equality is something really important for us. Generation Equality is a global space where the work is focusing to prevent violence in all its modalities that affect girls, teenagers, and young women. And we are participating directly within the Action Coalition, Gender-Based Violence, as one of the youth lead institutions. And for us, this is really important because we give another perspective. As we have been working many projects here in Guatemala, we try to share this, what we have learned, and we have facilitate meetings, and we have met different young people of different organizations in the world. And I think that that's something that has motivated us a lot to continue with this work. In this space, we have been able to make alliances with other youth organizations that are participating in the coalitions. We have learned from projects that are working around the world, and I think that working during this time in Generation Equality has been the opportunity of us to raise awareness about the problems that we as girls and teenagers live. Well, we have experience of the reality of the girls and teenagers from Guatemala, but because of having these opportunities of participating in events with the people of different countries, we have learned different perspectives. So we're really happy that we can be part of the Action Coalition Gender-Based Violence, and we are really looking forward to continue working and raising awareness about the problems that my generation and that we are facing, as all the panelists have said. So we are excited to seeing the results and the work that is gonna be being doing during this time.
Thank you, Eileen. So I want to do another round of questions with you. We are short on time though, so I'm going to ask that we keep this round relatively brief when we go back to kind of answering some of those questions. I feel like we're trying to be mindful of people's time. We probably needed like 3 hours for this event, but at least we get highlights of all the work that's happening. So I'm going to go back to you, Liana. Tell us a little bit more about how USAID is supporting national governments and stakeholders around this issue of school-related gender-based violence, especially within the context of kind of COVID response. You're on mute, Liana.
Thank you. It had to happen at least once. But yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to address this question. And one thing I think is important is, we recognize that for students to learn, they must have access to safe, equitable, and quality learning environments. And one of the things I want to say here, I've worked, for 20 years in the international development realm, and a lot of our focus has been on getting girls into school. But though we've made a lot of progress in the arena, one of the things that always strikes me is that we're working to get girls into what essentially is male-dominated systems. When you look at education systems globally, the policymakers tend to be heavily male, the principals are school directors, the inspectors. And we do know that, for example, female teachers and teachers who may be from a sexual minority also experience gender-based violence in the school systems. And I can't help but think, if we don't continue pushing as hard as we push to get girls into school, to get more women and folks who may be gender or sexual minorities into positions of leadership within the education systems, that we'll start seeing policies change more rapidly. We'll see schools really addressing gender-based violence in the classroom. So I think, that's an important area for us to all look at. I do think that in 2014 really was a pivotal year for USAID. We saw the need for more of a global conversation on how violence and discriminatory gender norms were hindering educational success. And at that time, we began supporting the UN Girls Education Initiative, or Ungai, to create the global working group to end school-related gender-based violence. And we remain active participants with that group. This really important group has really done a fantastic job leading and fostering partnerships, developing global guidance, and building the evidence base around school-related gender-based violence. And we're just so proud to be a part of this partnership. And I really want to give a shout out to USAID's colleagues in our Africa Bureau, because they've really led the agency in this arena. I think I'm going to maybe just move more directly to how we work to support ministries of education. And I think it's important that we don't just focus, although as a bilateral donor, we do have, I think, leverage an important relationship with ministries of education, but we really also see the need to partner with local organizations in countries where we work to really scale up we need to take a multi-pronged approach, looking at policy and practice, addressing cultural issues. And to do this, we have to work simultaneously at the national policy level with ministries, with schools, but also we have to work with communities and families. And I think that's where our partner NGOs really excel. And just to take a look at some of the things that we try to incorporate into USAID education programs, things like supporting the development of accountability measures with teachers, instructors, faculty, and administrators, working with NGOs and local governments to help provide safe modes of transportation to and from education institutions, looking for ways to address and shift harmful gender and social norms, ensure programs include components that address the physical and emotional safety of learners, and making sure that processes are in place to refer victims of violence to support services. Just really quickly, one example. In Uganda, USAID has worked very closely with the Ministry of Education and Sports to develop and scale up nationally mandated school-based curricula to prevent school-related gender-based violence and build the social and emotional competencies of learners. They're working to develop a protocol for creating and sustaining safe and positive learning environments to prevent and reduce incidents of violence. These protocols are now informing the development of a new national strategic plan on violence against children in Uganda. USAID also works closely with the gender unit at the Ministry of Education. And again, I think working to develop curricula is so important so that it gets integrated throughout the entire system. And then finally, we're working to train more than 4,500 community members and establishing over 1,000 village child case management committees. And I just can't stress how important these community support systems are to schools. And given the time, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Liana. And actually, one of the great points, you made several good points, but one of them is related to this working group that Ungai leads. We're a part of it. It really is phenomenal. So I'm going to go over to you, Antara, and tell us a little bit more about this Srgbv working group.
Thank you so much. And, thank you, Liana, for those really kind comments. I hope my colleague Sujata is on and has heard that, because she's really led this work for us. Yes, we are so pleased that we have had the support of USAID in developing and growing this group, and Together for Girls has been a key partner, as is Safe to Learn. The working group is actually a partnership of over 100 members representing civil society, education unions, academia, bilaterals and multilaterals, and several UN agencies. We co-chair it jointly with UNESCO, and I've been told it's a very active and vibrant space, which brings together technical expertise on gender equality, education, and then those sort of two parallel streams of violence against women and girls and violence against children, two movements which don't always work together as much as we would like. The working group has been recognized as a collective voice, and it's been instrumental in ensuring that larger programs and approaches to prevent and respond to violence against children do take into consideration the gendered elements of not just the cause of violence, but also in responding to that violence. So for example, when there are in case management of cases of sexual violence against children, it's important to not just make sure that the entire process and the actors are age sensitive, but also that they are gender sensitive. And that's as important for boys as it is for girls, and perhaps even more important for transgender children. The working group holds learning symposiums. It has separate working groups on different thematic areas. We talked about the measurement one earlier. And these have been platforms that have surfaced some really important issues that in the implementation of programs related to Srgbv. So I'm going to keep it short. This is really sort of what we do. We broker research, we broker collaboration, we disseminate, but most of all, I'd like to think we make sure that different actors working on violence against children in the education system are constantly reminded that addressing gender inequality is key to addressing violence.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Antara. Martha, over to you. Tell us a little bit more about how you're engaging in these big global moments we mentioned before, like generation equality. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you again. Just like it has been mentioned by Anta, for instance, what she has just talked about, FAWE is part of a number of global platforms and initiatives. In the interest of time, I will just mention just a few of them. And I will start off with the Gender at the Center Initiative, that's the GCI. And this was as way back as July 2019, when the GCI was launched by the G7 members under the leadership of the government of France. The GCI, like all of us I'm sure are aware, is built around the gender responsive education sector plans. And this is what is done at country level, the capacities, building capacities of civil society organizations at country level to be able to engage with the ministries of education and other partners to ensure that all the education sector plans are gender responsive. And initially this has been in 8 countries, and this is that is in Sub-Saharan Africa. We could talk of Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. And the Global GCI Alliance consists of a number of partners, like I've mentioned. Ungai is part of that, GPE, UNESCO, and Plan International, and also the Forum for African Women Educationalists. In this, we have been able to build the capacities, but among the things that we have targeted is to elicit demand and public as well as political support to foster gender mainstreaming in all aspects at the national level, and also to strengthen civil society, like I mentioned, at national level, to lead public engagement and political advocacy. And all this has been because of the partnerships at that level, which is basically backed by advocacy. I can also mention of the Beijing Plus 25 review and the Generation Equality Advocacy. And this is October 2020, where FAWE was nominated to the AU Youth Envoy Steering Committee on the Beijing Plus 2025. The committee oversaw the organization of youth dialogues across the 5 regions of Africa. And in this, FAWE is picked on because of her presence in the 33 countries across the continent. And FAWE has also previously been involved in the Generation Equality Youth Consultations meetings that have culminated into the call to action. I also want to mention the partnership with Global Campaign for Education. FAWE is a member of the GCE, and we have previously served in the African GCE committees, that is the African Regional Budget Committee under the stewardship of ANSEFA. And GPE is a partner. We also have a memorandum of understanding with the GPE, and we have jointly built the capacity of the Africa civil society organizations and gender responsive education sector planning through the regional workshops. And a good example is the capacity building that was done in 2018 for the FAWE youth, the young people. And this was in partnership with the GPA. And FAWE also partners with GPA on key African events. For instance, under the Gender is My Agenda campaign, which is a biannual convening, which brings together over 80 civil society organizations to advocate for the rights of the girls. And lastly, I would just want to mention that in 2020, FAWE joined the GPE Global Education Summit and has been keen on supporting the Raise Your Hand campaign across Africa. The FAWE youth leaders have also been very strong and have worked with the GPE in this partnership. Yeah,
thank you so much, Martha. Again, phenomenal work. So important for you all to have that support so that you can do all this amazing work that you're doing. Eileen, we're going to wrap up with you again. Very briefly, tell us a little bit more about the Transforming Education Working Collective that you're engaged in.
Thank you so much. Transform Education is a coalition of young feminist lead networks and young feminist activists working to transform education for gender equality through advocacy, capacity growing, and solidarity growing. It was incubated by and is hosted by Ungai, as Antara said some minutes ago. And through consultations, gender-based violence was identified as an urgent issue that had to be addressed. As everyone has been saying during this panel, well, we started a few months ago and asked networks doing work in their communities to join. We're still growing with this specific collective, and the Srgb working collective is led by Chalkback and Las Niñas Lideran. We will work closely with the Global working group to end Srgb hosted by Ungai and UNESCO to draw an intergenerational co-leadership. Within the groups, we will create joint advocacy messages, create campaigns, resources, participate in influencing opportunities, capacitating growing workshops, and have access to intergenerational through leaderships. And the ultimate objective of Transform Education is to be able to strengthen the work that is already happening in communities to end Srgb. We know that many people is working on this, so we want to work so this can be rentable to learners, to be able to have access to relevant resources for Srgb, to be treated like the human rights abuse it is, and for it to end. And as a last message, we would like to invite all the key stakeholders on this call to partner with feminist youth lead networks to be co-creators and co-leaders in ending Srgb. I motivate you to continue working in an intergenerational way because these motivate us, and I hope that we can motivate you too.
Perfect. And with that note, I just want to say the important work that Eileen, that Sophie are doing, this idea of engaging survivors, those with lived experience, youth, to push this political agenda from the movement we've seen in the UK, and I saw some things in the chat there around everyone's invited, to Me Too campus in Kenya. You know, as a survivor myself of child sexual abuse, you know, the importance of survivor voices and that political push to create change is absolutely essential. And we need to find more and better ways to engage and support those voices to demand the kinds of changes that need to happen on this agenda. I want to close with telling you that we have a call to action that we have produced with together with Ungai and Safe to Learn. There is going to be a link that's going to be shared. It really calls on organizations moving forward with concrete commitments to be made around specific areas like policy change, data and evidence, investment, partnership, all the stuff we've talked about here today. So I encourage you to go onto the website, we'll list it there, to sign on as an individual, as an organization. We're going to try to get as many signatures as we can to continue to really elevate the issue of ending gender-based violence in and through schools over the next few months. And with that, I want to end with a quote from the great Harriet Tubman, who was an American activist and abolitionist who was born into slavery and eventually rescued dozens of slaves from freedom. She said, "Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars and change the world." So thank you, each and every one of you, for all that you're doing and are still going to do moving forward to make this great dream of ending gender-based violence in and through schools a reality. Thank you so much.